Good morning, beautiful people. I hope you are having a wonderful day so far. Today I want to talk about failure, specifically training to failure. Should we do it? How often should we do it? What are the benefits? What are the downsides? First, should you do it? Yes. 100 million %. Yes. We have multiple meta-analyses, collections of studies. There's probably over 50 studies now that show training to failure is beneficial. Both of the meta-analyses have shown that there's almost no difference between training to failure and leaving about a rep or two in reserve, but they lean towards training to failure being better. And if you never train to failure, how are you going to know where 1 or 2 reps in reserve, 1 or 2 reps away from failure is? That's my question to you. You need to train to failure at least sometimes. I don't think every single set needs to be taken to failure, but I also don't think that there's really that much of an issue with doing it. The main downside of training to failure is just fatigue. That's it. It's just you are going to cause mainly central nervous system fatigue, so perception of effort is what you can think of that as. It just really, that last rep, those last couple reps are very taxing on your perception of effort for the rest of the workout. So imagine, I'm sure you've done a heavy set of squats, I hope so. When you do that last rep where you're just grinding it out, I'm talking a 5-6 second squat rep where you close your eyes, you open them, and you think you're at a Juice WRLD concert. That type of squat rep, that thing will take it out of you. I need to rest for a good 3 to 5 minutes after a set of squats where that's my last rep. And the additional stimulus, this is where stimulus to fatigue ratio comes in, because the additional growth stimulus that I'm getting from that last rep, is it really worth the additional fatigue that I'm incurring? Probably not. And the research shows that it's probably not as well. If we look at the literature, there's literally a graph on the paper, on the meta-analysis, that shows essentially stimulus and then neuromuscular fatigue. And the stimulus on that last rep, it's that last rep right before failure that you really just can leave off. But again, you will never know where 1 rep away from failure is if you never train to failure. And that study did show that there is more benefit to training to failure. And in terms of gauging your reps in reserve accuracy, some people still peddle the myth that people are bad at gauging reps in reserve accuracy. And that is not true. That we have meta-analysis that's kind of old at this point, it's like from 2021, that shows that as long as you're training heavy with an 85% max or heavier, which is about a 12 rep, that'll take you about 12 reps to get to failure, you're very accurate. And then we even have a new study that used old people and young people, and they found that both of them could determine 3 reps in reserve very accurately using 85% of their 1 rep max. So people can do it accurately, and especially a trained lifter can do it accurately. I refuse this myth that people can't gauge it accurately. If anything, I find that people are doing a little bit too much just with my own clients. And maybe that's biased because my clients are dogs and they like to train hard. But I find myself telling them, hey, that was not 1 rep in reserve, brother. That was failure. And again, that's also because I will always say that I would rather have you overshoot than undershoot. So go a little bit too hard. Who cares? Go for that rep. Get the partial. Because it is going to be, at the end of the day, training to failure is more stimulus than leaving a rep in the tank. That's just point blank period how it is. But it is that fatigue. That's the thing that we're talking about. It's not about whether or not you're getting more stimulus. It's just whether or not that stimulus is worth it from a fatigue standpoint. And that's also going to depend on the other training variables that you have, mainly frequency and volume. So if you're training every other day, if you're doing full body every other day, or if you're doing something like upper lower, where you repeat like lower 6 times a week, Ugh, shit. If you're doing one of those splits, it's going to be less important that you're training to failure. And the other thing is volume. If you're doing a million sets, yeah, probably less important. So my practical application for this is just train to failure on the second set or the last set of whatever you're doing. So if you're doing 2 sets for an exercise, then the first set, leave 1 rep in the tank. And then the second set, train to failure or train 0 reps in reserve. And people will debate what 0 reps in reserve is, if it's where you actually go for the rep. I don't think it is. So I will say that 0 reps in reserve is where you don't go for the rep. You don't get that partial. I guess that does get kind of tricky with what is it if you go for the rep and get the partial? Is that negative reps in reserve? I don't know. I just think it's easier to say 0 reps in reserve is where you stop and you're like, yeah, it was cooked. There's no way I could have done another rep. If I would have tried, I would have got a partial. And if you do try and get a partial, that's also 0 reps in reserve. I don't care. That's just how I like to do it. You can set it up however you want. It's arbitrary anyways. So yeah, then when you're talking about, you always need to take these things, when you're asking yourself the question of, should I train to failure? You always need to ask yourself, well, what is my frequency and what is my volume? So if you're doing more sets for that muscle group, say maybe you have 2 sets of pec deck into 1 set of chest press. Maybe you do, I would say in that case scenario, I would do 1 rep in reserve on the first set, 0 on the second, and then 0 on the chest press as well. And then something like a squat or an SLDL, I'll normally give a range. So I'll say let's do 0 to 1, because those are things that are a lot more taxing on the central nervous system. And those are also things that are less safe to fail on. Like with deadlifts, for example, normally I'll give you that 0 to 1. That's how I'll program it for my clients, is 0 to 1, because I really don't want you trying for that rep and getting a partial and throwing your back out and having to not do hinges for another 2 to 4 weeks, right? Because getting injured is the last thing that we want. And then that also comes into play with, that can be an issue of when you come back, now you might be scared. And now you might be unknowingly throttling yourself because you're afraid to hurt yourself again. So I really just don't like prescribing training to failure on those big movements. And again, especially if you're going to be programming multiple sets of them, normally I don't. Normally I'll only program 1 set of those really big, heavy movements. And part of that is just because they cause so much fatigue. And I'm not talking about fatigue here. I'm talking about that central nervous system fatigue and that within session fatigue. And I'm sure you've noticed this is, again, after you do a heavy set of squats, you're going to have to wait a good 3 to 5 minutes to do another set. I don't know, maybe you can do it in a minute and a half. Maybe you just have a crazy cardiovascular health. And that's going to be another thing of when you're determining your rest periods, it's mainly going to come down to cardiovascular health, because that's the biggest sort of limiter with your rest period, is how good your heart and your lungs are. And I'll tell you right now, I don't do enough cardio to recover from a heavy set of squats in 2 minutes. I have clients that do. I have some clients that run marathons, like, can recover very quickly. It's honestly kind of insane. But yeah. And then I guess you could also, there's probably also a difference in recovery time when it comes to fiber types. So certain muscles, because we have differences in fiber distribution between slow and fast twitch fibers, between people and between muscle groups. So certain muscle groups are more fast twitch dominant than others. And the thing that I always think about is the forearms are essentially all type 1 fibers, and that's why a lot of people say that you can't really grow them past, if they're not growing from whatever you're doing already, that you're probably not going to grow them. And I'm kind of that believer. I don't know, my coach has me train forearms. I do it unwillingly, but I do it. And it's the same thing with abs. Abs are fairly type 1 fiber dominant, and then like quads are fairly type 2 fiber dominant. And so that kind of goes into the recovery is going to be a little bit muscle fiber specific, and then it's also going to be, or muscle group specific, and then it's also going to be individual specific. And Yeah, most things you're probably gonna be good after 2 minutes. We've got one rest time meta-analysis that showed basically no differences between groups, between super short rest periods, I think less than a minute, and up to longer ones of 5 minutes plus. And it did tend around that 2 to 3 minutes is probably the best amount of time to rest. Again, it's going to be fairly individual dependent. We had another study come out fairly recently where they had people self-select their rest periods, and then they had another group that just did 2 minutes across the board. And the group that self-select ended up doing more. They ended up resting more total time, but there was no differences in outcomes in either strength or hypertrophy, muscle growth. So take that as you will. I think, yeah, with that 2 to 3 minutes, and you can probably go even lower than that again on certain muscles. But that would be my suggestion for rest times. For training to failure, I already gave my 2 cents. I think you should do it, yes, but I don't think you should do it all the time. And even if you do train to failure on every set, I really don't think it's going to make that big of a difference either. If you're doing bone crushing failure, where you're doing partials and then lengthen partials after, I'm just anecdotally, right? I used to do some crazy shit. I used to train my quads. I would do leg extensions to failure, and then I would do lengthened partials to failure, past failure partials. And then I would get off and do sissy squats to failure with lengthened partials on sissy squats. And I still grew quite a bit. And I used to do partials on hack squats and leg press. So you really can train to failure and train past failure and still see great growth. It's just, again, is it worth it in terms of the fatigue and in terms of the, like, I had leg days where I'd throw up. Probably not. But it was fun. I'll tell you that. Anyways, if you learned something, like, subscribe, drop a comment if you have any questions. I'll catch y'all in the next one. Peace.